Join us on a journey toward a freer world through sound economic policy and a love for individual freedom. Welcome to Free the World.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Free the World, a show by Students for Liberty where we explore the policies, ideas, and concepts that set us free. I'm your host, Global Marketing Director at Students for Liberty here, Joshua Eckel. And before we get into the show, I'll do a quick pre-show announcement. LibertyCon is coming back to Washington, D.C. this February. You can check out more information about LibertyCon at libertycon.com. We're going to have some wonderful speakers there: Tom Palmer, John Mackey, David Friedman, Spike Cohen, and several more that we are about to announce that I'm sure you'll be excited to hear about. You can get your tickets, as I said, at libertycon.com, so definitely check that out. But before we get into the guest today, I wanted to frame the conversation a bit. Today, we're going to talk about plagiarism and politics, and really wrestle with the question of whether we're losing academic integrity in favor of political bias. So today, and I'll bring him on in a second, we're going to be joined by Phil Magnus. Phil is an economic historian whose work focuses on the United States and the broader Atlantic world. His research explores the intersection of history and political economy, including the 19th century, as well as longer-term trends in the macroeconomy, such as taxation, trade, economic inequality. He also works on the political economy and business ethics of higher education, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Phil we'll bring Phil on if he's here and ready to rock. Good morning, Phil. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Phil, I'm going to just give some more context to the actual topic, and then we can go into some of the questions. So, plagiarism is kind of the center of what we were going to talk about today. And I know you've done a lot of writing about this. Yes. As you know, as many of our audience knows, back in December, when there was all these protests happening across the country in the context of Israel's war in Gaza, there was this big explosion that happened at Harvard with former President Claudine Gay being exposed for multiple examples of plagiarism in her work. And I remember two headlines. The Guardian questioned how serious the accusations were. There was an opinion piece in the New York Times saying that plagiarism is, quote, the mildest academic sin. So obviously you've spent a lot of time writing about this and analyzing this and looking at this in the context of maybe political bias. And so one of the things I wanted to maybe kick us off with was ask the question about whether you could briefly explain what plagiarism is, obviously, just from a high level perspective, and why documentation, citing sources in academia is incredibly an important thing that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So plagiarism, just the basic simple definition of it is using the work of other people without giving them proper credit. And this could be anything from copying their words verbatim without doing proper quotation marks or citations. It could also be a paraphrase that steals somebody else's idea and doesn't acknowledge that was the origin point of it. And schools, universities have traditionally been very strict about plagiarism. It's considered kind of like one of the cardinal sins of academic research because when you borrow somebody else's ideas and then obscure where those ideas came from, you're basically misleading your reader. You're doing a disservice to your reader because they're no longer able to replicate the pattern and thought process that you went through when you were composing your argument, which is an essential component of replicability. The scientific method is we should be able to not only understand the argument that's being made, but all the pieces that went into it, including proper credit to other people that contributed to those ideas.
So obviously that makes logical sense. It's a very centric principle in academia. What do you think the long-term effects that are caused by plagiarism is? Obviously, it's got an immediate problem, but how does this play out in the long term? And who exactly does it hurt?
Well, I think it hurts the reader first and foremost, because the reader is trying to follow the course of an argument. The reader is trying to replicate the thought process that went into making a claim. And if you have a very controversial work, you're making a bold claim that you want your reader to be convinced of, it's actually in the interest of the author to lay out that thought process, including documenting when and where you borrowed ideas and sources and content from other people. And then the second part of it is the person that gets plagiarized, the victim, so to speak, is effectively having credit denied to them for something that they previously put an effort into. So if I wrote a book and found later that somebody else copied it verbatim without giving me credit, that's kind of cheating me out of my effort and my initiative to write the original work and stealing my idea. So it's basically a form of academic theft in that sense.
Okay, so you've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I do want to get into the situation with that happened at Harvard and some of the other
Yep.
stuff that's more recently in the news. But I am curious to just discuss maybe the bigger picture, like the seriousness of the issue, the scope of the issue, and why. Like, is this a systemic problem in academia? Obviously, you've researched this a lot. I'm curious as to kind of your read on where the
Yeah.
scope of the nature of the issue is now.
Yeah. So if you look at academia, and this includes everything from students to professors in the classroom, this is something we discuss, Jason Brennan and I discuss in our book, Cracks in the Ivory Tower. We look at the problem of cheating. And it turns out that cheating at a very small scale is fairly pervasive in academia. A lot of people skirt the edges, usually to get an easy grade or to finish something up. It's a way of almost a lazy approach to doing academic work. And yet it's fairly pervasive. But it's also something that, at least until very recently, was considered a very clear-cut ethical line that you do not cross. Most universities and colleges have very strict honor codes that have penalties that are quite severe if you get caught plagiarizing. Like minor instances, usually the penalty is you take a 0 in that class, or you have to completely repeat the assignment, depending on what it happens to be. And a major instance of plagiarism, including at the Ivy Leagues, would result in things like suspension for a year or expulsion. And I think in 2021 or so was the most recent year we have data. Plagiarism was the second most common academic misconduct charge that was brought against students that resulted in either their suspension or expulsion from the university. So it's something that schools have taken seriously for a long time.
Okay, well then let's talk about the Ivy Leagues to touch on that point. So major institutions like Princeton and Cornell were recently twisting themselves into a pencil to basically defend, in many cases, outright plagiarism cases. And these were brought on some of their top history professors.
Absolutely.
And the reason they were defending them, at least according to the public, was because there was some political bias there. Many people saw that. So I'm curious as to whether you could unpack what happened first and foremost, and then we can go into the nuance. So what exactly happened? Tell the story a little bit more for our readers to
learn. So the Princeton Cornell case, I was deeply involved in that. I was the person that essentially broke the story. And it involved a history professor by the name of Kevin Cruz. He's fairly well known. He's a regular guest on MSNBC and kind of became famous as this Twitter attack dog on the political left that would invoke these phrases like, well, I'm a historian. Here's my take on the political news of the day. And it was always from a very far left perspective. He was very clearly a partisan Democrat actor. And that's how he became famous, got a huge following because of that. But I was reviewing one of his books. It's a book about religious revivals in the United States connected to, he claimed there was like a libertarian Christian alliance to resist the New Deal. And I'm reviewing this book for an academic journal. It's a very typical thing that you do. It was in an area that I have some expertise, the history of the libertarian movement. And I noticed a passage in there that just kind of jumped out at me. Like I was scratching my head. I was like, I've read that before. And I didn't really know exactly where, but something seemed on. And it just kept gnawing at me until I tracked it down and I found it was a copied passage out of another article, a fairly obscure article about Abraham Lincoln, which is another area that I work on. So I put 2 and 2 together, and it struck me as something was just amiss here. And my first reaction to it was actually to start looking around for other examples, other instances. Because usually when there's plagiarism, it's like where there's smoke, there's fire. That plagiarists don't typically just error and make 1 or 2 small passages that they copy. It's often a much more systematic thing that recurs over several works. And I started looking at some of his other writings, and I found kind of like The Smoking Gun, which was his doctoral dissertation at Cornell University. And in the opening passages of his doctoral dissertation, where he's laying out the thesis of the entire work, I found they were copied from 2 other historians, almost verbatim, including probably the most egregious. So he wrote a thesis about race relations and desegregation in Atlanta, and he had copied basically an entire paragraph out of a book on race relations in Detroit. And he uses the exact same words, but he switches out the city. He swaps Detroit for Atlanta and passes it off as his own and says, this is basically the thesis statement of my dissertation. So I did what any responsible person would do at the time. I gave Princeton and Cornell opportunities to respond. So I contacted Princeton, where he works, and he did the dissertation at Cornell. There were some other academics that reached out to them and said, wait, something's amiss here. Here are some instances of plagiarism. And I had never heard anything back from Princeton. They basically like ignored it. I guess it went into like a spam box or something. And then after a due period of time passed, I decided, well, I'm going to write this up, and published it in Reason magazine. And it was basically a very straightforward case that showed instances of plagiarism in this guy's work. To add insult to injury, Cruz, being the attack dog on Twitter, had previously gone after figures on the right for various degrees of plagiarism, including lesser offenses than the ones he had engaged in. There was a guy that was being considered, I think, in the last Trump administration for an appointment, and they found that in his doctoral dissertation or his master's thesis or something, that he had excerpted passages without quotation marks, although he did include the citation. So it's a form of plagiarism, although lesser than just completely stealing it outright. And Kevin Cruz is all over Twitter saying, we'd expel this student, we'd fail them if he was in my classroom. And he's all offended that this person's even being considered for a political appointment, says it's discrediting. And yet here he is doing the exact same thing. And when I finished the Reason article, I predicted that because of his high political profile, there will probably be people on the other side that discard the evidence and set that aside because they are invested in protecting and upholding him as a political pundit, as a political spokesman, even though the evidence was pretty strong against him that he had committed a fairly cardinal sin for academic work.
Yeah, and I could see why this would massively undermine like trust and respect of these major Ivy League schools. Do you feel like this is something that is happening across the board in many of these Ivy Leagues? Do you feel like this is a niche situation? I mean, based on your research?
Well, it's turned out to be, looks like it's fairly pervasive.
Yeah.
And the Claudine Gay case proved that. But there have also been like a half dozen other cases at elite universities that have come out in the wake of Claudine Gay, where they've just looked at their basic academic work, their doctoral dissertations, or their published articles, and they find, hey, there are uncredited passages that are lifted from other scholars. And like the Claudine Gay case, because I had been known for working on academic ethics, both in my book and then the Kevin Cruz case, which was like a trial run about a year before it. So some of the people that discovered plagiarism there reached out to me for comments, and I reviewed some of those the passages side by side. And it was clear as day that she had cut and paste, and not properly credited the sources that she was drawing from. And yet the same pattern happened there. Anyone that pointed out plagiarism in Claudine Gay's work came under attack, not for their evidence, but for their politics. They were said, well, they're on the wrong side of the political spectrum, so obviously it doesn't matter the evidence that they bring to bear.
Understood. So maybe looking forward and thinking a little bit about the implications. Obviously, people like yourself and other people that research and dig this up and bring it out to the public are playing a really important role in making sure that the situation is at least aware, people are aware of it, and that there's some sort of effort to resolve it. What do you think the impact is for young people that are going through college right now looking at this? I mean, this seems to me to be setting a bad standard. It seems to me to basically give the wrong incentives. I'm curious as to how you feel like young people should maybe affect it, or how they should look at it.
Well, if I was a student at Princeton or Cornell or Harvard or some of these institutions that have had these plagiarism cases, I'd be asking for my money back in the classroom. I mean, you have professors like Cruz and even executives, leaders of the university like Claudine Gay, are committing acts that students would fail their classes for. Students would be called before the honor council if they committed the exact same violation. So there's an element of hypocrisy there that I think students need to pay attention to and be asking questions about when they look at, like, what's the value of these institutions that are charging them $50,000 or $100,000 a year to get a university degree in. So that there's a basic quality issue there. The second implication, and the data tend to support this, higher education's always kind of been on the left of center, at least as far back as we know. The professors tend to be predominantly liberal to left leaning in their politics. But historically, there were always minority viewpoints that ranged from conservative to moderate to libertarian to everything in between. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen in the last 15 to 20 years is that all of those minority viewpoints are in decline on campus. New hiring has tilted overwhelmingly to the left. And if you do look at the survey data, it's now basically a supermajority of professors identifying the political left. And what that does is it creates an echo chamber in the creation of research and the scientific process. Excuse me, especially in the social sciences and humanities, some of the softer fields where a lot more normative value judgments enter into the research. And what it means in that echo chamber is that academic misconduct, such as plagiarism, other forms of theft like misrepresenting documents, data fraud, things like that, are not getting called to task at the same rate that they would have been even 20, 25 years ago when you had a more ideologically diverse university system, because there's nobody on the other side to really challenge them internal to the university. And instead, you have an echo chamber that just agrees with political opinions and agrees with conclusions, including those that are based off of fraudulent work and based off of misconduct. And that's, I think, exactly what we're seeing here. So someone like Claudine Gay had her defenders that just said, well, no, these are ideological attacks from the other side. Same thing with Kevin Cruz. He had his defenders. So these are attacks from the other side. So therefore, we can dismiss them. Whereas maybe 20, 25 years ago, I think a more diverse university system would have been willing to scrutinize that.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I wanted to ask is, obviously it's one thing to look at a problem, to address the problem, to make it public. I am curious in the long term and what's a solution to this problem? I mean, what can be done to protect integrity, protect honesty in academia, and make sure that this problem doesn't persist? Do you have any thoughts on solutions or go forward plan?
Yeah. Two things. First, restoring something of an intellectual diversity to the academy, some ideological balance, bring the professoriate back in a way that actually reflects the whole range of opinions in the American public. The students that are going to college, you have everything from right-leaning to left-leaning to libertarian and everything in between. And yet if they're only encountering left-leaning faculty, they're only getting one viewpoint. And that one viewpoint is less discerning and less scrutinizing on problematic research coming out of its own side. So restoring that balance would go a long way. And then the second component is we actually have to look at these institutions, especially elite institutions in the Ivy League, and basically ask them to hold their own faculty to account, to apply their own rigorous standards that they used to follow the rules that are on the book. And that includes rigorously policing against plagiarism.
Understood. Okay, well, Phil, I appreciate the work that you're doing to expose this and bring it to light. I appreciate the commentary and the time that you spent. Do you have a place that people should go if they want to learn more about this problem or learn more about your work?
Absolutely. So I publish quite a bit on independent.org, which is the Independent Institute's website. And then I'd urge everyone to check out my book with Jason Brennan, Cracks in the Ivory Tower, which has a whole discussion of some of the incentive structures of why people cheat and why they get away with it.
Understood. And I know you're also writing at philmagnus.com.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. Well, Phil, thank you for taking time to talk about this issue. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, have a great day. So if you are interested, audience, in learning more a bit about what Students for Liberty is and how it can help impact your life, you can go to our website at studentsforliberty.org. We have a local coordinator program, which is our premier program for young people on campus in the United States and across the world. The program is designed to give you the tools that you need to go out into your careers after college and during college to make an impact and further liberty in whatever your passion or interest is. So if you're interested in joining that, you can go to join.studentsforliberty.org to join the local coordinator program, and also check out the conference that we're going to be holding in DC on February 7th, 2025, libertycon.com. I appreciate your time, everyone. We'll see you again soon.